Someone's in trouble.
Where?
Who knows? Stand by for emergency materialization.
Hi!
Porto!
Yes, and what do you do?
We had to make it a pretty big one.
All right, let's get on with it.
I walk in eternity.
What's that supposed to mean?
It means
Here come the drums!
So here it comes, the sound of drums. Here come the drums, here come the drums.
Dun, 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 dun. Hello, everyone out there in Doctor Who land. This is Pull to Open, your favorite Doctor Who podcast. I am Pete Paschal.
I'm Chris Taylor, and we are on a quest to watch all of Doctor Who in random order.
Mm-hmm.
And we're pretty far into the quest now, wouldn't you say, Pete? What are we, 20 episodes into this thing?
20 episodes in. Wow. That's like...
Something like that.
This is an epic season-long adventure. 20 episodes. Yeah, we're getting there. We're doing okay. We're getting to the point where we might actually start running into stuff we've already done.
Speaking of epic season-long adventures, I don't know if you have been following the news about the upcoming next season of Doctor Who.
Do tell me about it. I heard there's a guy named Dan, but that's about all I know.
Yes, that's the new companion, and it was revealed this week at Comic-Con, the virtual Comic-Con, that Chris Chibnall is writing the whole season as one story.
Oh my.
Yes, which of course to veteran Whovians like ourselves immediately puts us in mind of Trial of a Time Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though that was kind of like really four different things.
It really was. It sounds like this is not that. It sounds like he's trying to say that this is very definitely one ongoing story that has beginning, middle, and end, and will go to many different locations. But yeah,
I wonder why he feels this is the time for that. Doing the Game of Thrones style, or any number of shows that you really have to get into and follow. I always kind of felt Doctor Who had its episodic quality, even though there's certainly obviously several parts to many adventures. It's being able to sort of check in for a little while and check out. I thought that was sort of one of the good things about it. You kind of get both the dedicated fans like ourselves and the casual viewer.
Well, it's been a trend, right? And since Star Trek returned a couple of years ago, it's been going with season-long arcs rather than Monster of the Week episodes,
right? Or episodic. But some would say that hasn't been a good choice for Star Trek.
And it may not be a good choice with Doctor Who, but you know what? I'm always in favor of more experimentation.
I am too, and it's kind of like fandom is split already. And I think that's true of most franchises. You have these sort of schisms, and especially when new creative teams take over, and people will say, whatever, not my Doctor, or not my Star Trek, not my Law and Order SVU. Well, I don't think they say that, but
only if they did. That was
if only.
I mean, and I'm sure this one is going to be divisive as well. It wouldn't be Doctor Who if it wasn't, but it's interesting because it does sort of address the concern that when we were doing this podcast about the various episodes in the last season, like Spyfall, Fugitive of the Judoon, and The Timeless Children. I think our complaint almost every time was that there's not enough time to get into this really knotty, thorny story. With its massive changes to Doctor Who canon, right? And I think we both felt at the time that these changes were given short shrift. So if the idea of the new season is in any way to address the new canon of who the Doctor is and what her history is, I think that's potentially all for the good. And I think it's also what Chris Chibnall is used to. It's where he works best. It's his most successful show is obviously Broadchurch, which was that season long, still somewhat episodic, but definitely focused on the season long arc. So I'm excited to see what he can do with that, and with the new companions. I'm excited to see how American Doctor Who fans are going to feel about a very strong Liverpool accent aboard the TARDIS. Which
That's
we're gonna
Dan, I
get.
take it.
Yes, played by John Bishop.
Dan's a
I believe is the-
Liverpudlian.
Yeah, he's very scouse. I don't know if you, I can send you some clips of his comedy, but he's basically a stand-up comedian with an extremely strong local Liverpool accent, and very funny, and did sort of try to take over this Comic-Con panel a little bit. At least a lot of the questions were directed at him. And speaking of Game of Thrones, they also have the guy who played Grey Worm has a major role in this season as well. So
Nice. Well, on the accent front, I feel like New Who is making up for years, decades of standard sort of English received pronunciation that the original series. I mean, we've been in the original series for the last several episodes, and I got to say, you know, the accents. There's not a lot of variety back in the old days of the BBC, and I feel like New Who has been making up for that ever since it cast Chris Eccleston way back in 2005.
Yes, lots of planets over north, and then we had some very Cockney companions, and now we're very much in the Sheffield era.
Sheffield era.
The Sheffield era.
Let's rename it that.
Exactly, the Sheffield fam era. With the exception of Graham, everyone's got this thick Yorkshire accent, and the Doctor's adopted this Yorkshire accent. I have this. We've talked about this in the past. My whole theory of the Doctor and his / her accents being influenced by the last person they met, either before their regeneration or immediately after. That's a whole other story. But it's interesting, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but in the story that we're going to be talking about this week, Planet of Evil, there's also this sort of lack of accent diversity. You have a lot of the members of the spaceship that the Doctor and Sarah meet, and they've all got very upper class British accents, right? And some of their upper class British accents are slightly less upper class, and those are the working class people. Those are the grunts.
Always.
That's how you can tell.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how often, and not just in Doctor Who, but the stories would essentially have a bunch of people as guests in an episode, in a ship or in a building somewhere, a base under siege, and it's like guy 1, guy 2, guy 3, guy 4, and they're pretty much interchangeable down the round, and there was a while there, I feel like, particularly in the early 2000s, there was a very hard backlash against that, and that people they just did, everyone had to be a weird, quirky character and even a different color, and I think we've evened out sort of at a place where it makes sense. There's a good amount of character, but not so much variety that it's gratuitous. I'm sort of, it took so long to get here though, Chris.
It really did.
Now we're here. We're starting out here today with Planet of Evil, where it was just probably one of the first ships full of cookie cutter, similar stock character crew members.
Yeah,
with the uniform wise, also could use some work.
The disco soldiers. We'll definitely get to discussing that, and also how it's. I'm looking forward to discussing this because there is a fan theory that I came across that suggests that this is not the it's not just the entirely forgettable sort of mid-season Tom Baker episode that it is a story that is known as. But it's also a kind of a new start for the Doctor in an interesting way, a new aspect of the Doctor. So we'll get to that.
Well, let's hold that thought. Let's tease it out. Let's stretch it out.
Exactly. Later in the show, we'll be discussing how Planet of Evil may have changed Doctor Who forever.
But first, let me talk about Casper. No. You will sleep
Casper.
like an antimatter monster in one of these delicious...
Sleep like Anti-Man in a
mattresses.
black pool.
I'm just guaranteed they'll never sponsor us. But we're here,
you know,
1-800 mattress.
but
if you
Casper
want
the
us.
Friendly Ghost might sponsor this episode.
Ooh,
given that
absolutely.
That's kind of what we get. Casper the Unfriendly Ghost. Yeah, so let's set the scene a little.
All right.
We had just been to the 10th planet and the Crotons.
Mhm.
With the 10th planet, we went viral with one of our TikToks discussing the Cybermen, and that's why we just had a little special Cyberman episode.
Right. We corrected
to
the
respond
record.
to that. Yes.
Yeah. We showed our accountability.
Yeah.
And I think it was all to the good. Honestly, there was so much engagement on that post, and a lot of people clearly seeing the show and paying attention in the way sort of modern fans do, even if they maybe not have watched it for 30 years. They do clearly care about the characters, the monsters, the universe of this place that Doctor Who's creating, and it was just sort of really nice to see. And so when we came out and gave our response, it was good to see some positivity, and I just like the sort of showing sort of the continuity of the Cybermen, and I thought our secondary discussion, just throwing out some of the theories around them, and exploring how fandom now sort of interacts with these franchises and sort of creates their own almost like a multiverse of timelines and theories, and the show can now sort of feed off that and pick off the best of it, and to bring the sort of official canon in new directions, which is kind of a really cool modern phenomenon that I look forward to seeing more of.
Where we got to in the special episode is a very interesting point, that there really isn't that much of a history of the Cybermen, certainly not compared to the Daleks, that we can point to, and that's really an opening for the show to exploit, but moreover for its secondary media to exploit, to really dig into. So I'm looking forward to that. Anyway, so the randomizer then took us from the Crotons to Planet of Evil. And Planet of
Naturally.
Evil, yeah, of course it did. From Troughton to Baker, from late 60s to mid 70s. And it's astonishing to think, isn't it, that these stories were just 6 years apart. Because the difference that the world has gone through, and the Doctor Who has gone through, and I think the disco costumes of the space soldiers are sort of one element of it, but it just, everything looks different, and it's kind of psychedelic, and it's so colorful.
And part of it is like, it's funny, like we go from Troughton to Baker, both of which have been like known more for their comedic presence most of the time than sort of the seriousness, even though like I think that for both of them in different ways their natural comedy strengthens the seriousness. But if you look at the Crotons, I think you can easily make the case that it's fairly light in terms of tone, particularly compared to this. And it's not just the episodes, it's the era and the Doctor, and I think that matters a lot here. And not just all of that, but like there's also obviously there've been wholesale changes in the creative teams and the producers notably. So this episode is one of the first, it's not the first Philip Hinchcliffe episode, but some consider it the first true Hinchcliffe episode, because he had complete control over it from start to finish. It wasn't just him adapting scripts that had been written for the show. And you can kind of feel it. I mean, part of it's the set design, part of it's sort of the inevitability themes that are sort of explored throughout, but it's dark. It gets into some grim places, and I can sort of see why. We should probably talk about the actual story in a minute, but like you can see why they made the choice at the end to sort of pull back from having a really dark ending.
Yeah, we're definitely entering the gothic horror era of Doctor Who,
right?
For sure, with Hinchcliffe at all. But
we're just a little bit away from like the Talons of Weng Chang and Image of Fendal and these kind of gothic horror kind of moments that were really creepy, I found. And I found this one was kind of an version of that. You know, it's not quite as memorable as those other ones, but it's like there's a lot of like setting the scene here for the Doctor going to some dark places, and
Yeah. So speaking of setting the scene, our regular feature on the show is called TLDW. Either too long don't watch or too long didn't watch.
Too long don't watch. It's never so long you should watch.
Sorry,
I don't care how long it is. You should watch.
Sorry, I think that was a Freudian slip in terms of how I feel about Planet of Evil.
Oh man.
Yeah. But TLDW is the name of our segment, and we take it in turns to have a game show moment where you have 30 seconds per episode. And in this case, there are 4 episodes, so our standard 2 minutes. And this week, it is Pete's turn to summarize.
Is it really? Okay, I've got to close out my tabs. I've got to hide everything.
Yep. To be fair, there's not a lot of plot, really, when it comes down to it. I mean,
there's stuff. I don't know. I feel like I'm not the guy who should be doing this one, but yes, there's a lot of subtlety, and then not so subtlety and repetition. But it's Doctor Who, you know. You expect that.
All right, let's get into it. I'm going to start the timer. 3, 2, 1. Now.
Okay, so there's these guys on a planet, and they're mining something, and it's almost about to be night, and they're worried about nights, but they got to get the minerals back to their ship. So they try to sort of get the minerals out of the ground. In the meantime, the Doctor and Sarah come to the planet, but it's like 30,000 years in the future, way past where they wanted to be. And so what happens is the guys who are doing the mining, they get killed, except for the actual leader, who's at the site, and then this other ship comes to the planet, which is investigating all these deaths that are happening on this mining expedition. So what happens is the Doctor and Sarah quickly realize they're sort of on the edge of the universe, very distant planet, and this guy is actually mining antimatter because this is a planet's a boundary between our universe and an antimatter universe. But he's disturbed something conscious, something that is taking revenge for this plunder. And at the end of episode 2, the Doctor is like at the pit where this thing resides, and he falls in and negotiates with it. He doesn't die; he negotiates with it, and he guarantees they're going to bring back all the antimatter so that they'll be able to get away, because they haven't been able to take off in the ship that came because there's antimatter on board. So he comes back, tells everybody that they need to get rid of the antimatter. They don't, because the guy who's in the leader, he wants to revitalize the civilization, reboot it with all this incredible energy source. So there's a lot of back and forth on the ship of like, let's get rid of the antimatter, and people are like, no, it's the Doctor and Sarah, they're bad. Let's get rid of them. And so there's a lot of all this. Like, did we get rid of all the antimatter? I don't know. Like, where do you have any more? I don't know. And so they eventually get rid of it all because the guy who was the leader, he's actually transforming into one of these creatures. It's like anti-man, right? So they got to get rid of him too, and they can't because he multiplies into a bunch of these things. So the Doctor actually has to take him in the TARDIS to the thing and cures him of all that stuff. And so it's okay, and the ship doesn't get reflected back and crash, and everything's okay. And the Doctor and Sarah say go bye-bye.
All right, good shot.
I needed like another 10 or 15 there, something like that. It was close. It is
tough to, as you were saying, I'm like, how would I do this differently? I don't know. It's tough without sort of using the names of the crew members, right? Wyszynski and Sorensen and Salamar.
Right.
Like those are the big 3 prime movers of the plot.
And like Sorensen is a hard guy to crystallize because he's not really the bad guy. I mean, he's just this misguided dude.
So Sorensen's the scientist who was on the planet all along, and he's sort of, being changed by it, and he's the one who sends out the distress signal. And I have to say, the thing about Sorensen that I could not get past is the fact that for the entire story, he's wearing this like dirty brown velour kind of tracksuit, which is just like it's covered in marks. It just sort of, to us it reads guy standing on the street begging for loose change, right? It kind of, maybe it looked different in the 70s, but he does not look like someone that you would like immediately trust every word of as the crew of the rescue ship do. Like, they trust everything he says and just believe the doctor at every point. And he's just kind of this, dirty, gross guy. Just like, I don't know if this was like 5 minutes in the 70s when those brown tracksuits were actually appealing. But
and I don't mean to like we shouldn't be too unkind to the actor. Frederick Jaeger, I think is his name.
Yeah.
But I mean, I hate to pile on, but he's kind of this dumpy guy, and he's got the 5 o'clock shadow, and I get that he's playing a guy who is like stressed out. He's more of like an Einstein type, like the type of guy who just works 18-hour days because he wants to, because he's so dedicated to what he's doing. So he shouldn't be polished. I get it. But at the same time, he's also like the performance. He makes some odd choices, I would say, because you kind of want to see him go over the top a bit, and he's almost weirdly distant, dejected, subtle, quiet at places that you never. I found myself kind of wanting to see that sort of eyebrow raise or mustache twist, or like at least coming close to flying off the handle, as sort of you would expect from a madman, and it never really happens, which is a weird choice, I thought.
Yeah, and he doesn't have the arrogance that we would expect from someone in that position. Because he is, I don't know if you, like me, Pete, got incredible Inferno vibes here. Having just done Inferno, which is all about a scientist who is driven to the brink of madness and to, turning into a creature himself because he was looking for an energy solution for the planet. And here we are again, 5 years later with another scientist who is really driven to looking for this energy solution. That's why he wants to take those antimatter rocks away from the planet. It's definitely
it's always energy, which is, it could be today if you think about it, right?
It could be.
That's always an ongoing thing.
We talked about this with Inferno, like the British obsession in the 70s with finding new energy sources. And that seems to be what Doctor Who was obsessed with as well, like reflecting our fears and our 3-day weeks and our long lines for the gas station or petrol station.
Good you brought up Stallman. I think it's a good comparison, and I think it's worth unpacking. Like, why does Stallman work and why doesn't Sorensen work as well? And I think it's partly performance, because like the guy who played Stallman, his name escapes me now, but he is such a jerk. Like, I mean, you love to hate that guy, and he's a jerk because he also has like the Doctor, yes, as sort of an adversary, but also the Sir Keith character as an ongoing kind of foil for him to really bounce that personality off of. And Sorensen doesn't really have anybody, right? Like, he's there and he has his crew, but they're like the people who are already on the planet in the mining expedition are killed off right away, so we never get to know any of them. All the crew except for Vashtinsky and Salamar.
Yes, I kept forgetting it too.
I kept wanting to say Salamander.
yeah, exactly. Which, well, let's talk about Salamar. I mean, he is the ultimate disco spaceman. I mean, what is going on with that décolletage? I don't know. And those silver shoulder pads and we're supposed to take him seriously as the commander of this expedition while he is wearing something that makes him look like, I don't know,
he's just gone clubbing.
Yeah, he's like a reject from an Earth, Wind and Fire video. And it just, wow, how can you take yourself seriously in that role? I was surprised to discover that this guy is a Doctor Who veteran, Prentice Hancock. He's been in many other stories, and he was in Space 1999 as well. But he does not strike you as a good character actor. Like, he's got one setting, and that setting is toxic masculinity. He displays it throughout. By the way, we're in what, the 33rd century here, 34th century.
I think technically 37th, because it's like you see
37th?
it's the sign, and if you assume those are actual years, like because the sign at the very beginning, there's the gravesite, and someone puts down a thing, and I think it's like 37. I don't want to get it wrong, but it's like 166. So yeah, it's I guess the 38th century. Think about it.
Right. So we got to the 38th century, and all crews are still filled with white men.
Right. Actually, not
and,
even 38th. Oh, come to think of it, 380th.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because
So
it's not
ridiculously far
3,000,
ahead.
it's 37,000. Yeah. Which
It's
makes
just so
sense. Like,
ridiculous.
I wouldn't say necessarily makes sense, and I might be giving the writers a little too much credit to sort of say they thought about this, but maybe they did, because they were starting to think about this as more and more of a universe. But like the fact that they're talking about intergalactic travel, right? Which is rarely referenced in Doctor Who. You don't really hear a lot about casual travel among galaxies. That's what they're talking about here. They're talking about like we're way past like not just the Milky Way, but like even distant galaxies.
And it's sort of weird that the planet is called Zeta Minor, and apparently it's right on the edge of space, whatever that means. Like this is somehow the edge of the whatever the name is of the human empire that has begun to explore it.
Yeah,
what does that actually mean? The edge of, like, this is not a linear thing.
Yeah, that's exactly like it's. I gotta say, like as a kid, I thought it was cool, and this is speaking sort of more as someone who's just starting to really take in. At the time, I was really starting to take in the scale of the universe, right? Like, wow, like the distances between galaxies are vast, and the distances between clusters and then superclusters, like, and if you could theoretically go to the edge of the universe, like how mind-bogglingly far that would be. But if you think about like what they're doing here with this antimatter universe, it just feels like a really unsophisticated take on like another dimension, right? Like that you just go far enough out and you'll get there, which seems like the wrong thing, right? Like it's always now like ever since, you're like, well, if you want to, it's usually some dimensional thing you're going to wherever you are. Like it doesn't really matter where you are exactly. It's not actual space you're traveling to get to something that fundamentally different.
It does annoy me with Doctor Who when the writers just don't seem to be trying, and they just seem to have reached into a grab bag of sci-fi jargon, and they just pull something out like, oh, planet name Zeta Minor, that sounds good and science fiction-y. Oh, it's an antimatter planet on the edge of space, that sounds good. Like there's no thinking through this, there's no sort of respect for the concept. It's just sort of, yeah, that sounds good.
In their defense, like today you could easily research things on the internet, and just there's so much pop science now that it would be expected that anyone on the show probably read like any number of books by Brian Greene or Michio Kaku or whatever, and knows something. Whereas back then, I mean, pop science wasn't really a thing, and just finding someone who could name more than 3 other planets in the solar system was a thing. That said, certainly if you're a writer for Doctor Who, it would be an expectation you'd know more of this stuff.
Just to go back to the lack of diversity on this crew, because it does, even though it is all white men, there is one character that it does have the token black guy, Ponty, who unfortunately, follows sort of the unfortunate sort of subconsciously racist trope of, you kill off the black guy early in the story, which is unfortunate. But Ponty is played by an actor named Lewis Mahoney, who I immediately recognized as he's in Fawlty Towers.
Oh,
in the famous episode The Germans, where Basil goes crazy and sort of insults Germans staying in his hotel. He's the doctor. So ironically plays a doctor in a different show, who says that Basil needs rest in the hospital, right? And so he has that sort of famous bit role in that. I did not know, though, until I looked him up, that he's also in Blink.
Oh wow! Oh, is he?
Yes.
The guy? Wait a
He's
minute.
Billy Shipton, yes, who Sally Sparrow falls in love with and asks her out on a date, and then in the next scene, he's an old man, and the old man is played by Lewis Mahoney.
Wow. That came full
And
circle. That's awesome.
right, and a little sad news: he died in June last
Oh,
year
well, no.
at the age of 81.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, many years after his on-screen death in Blink.
Hmm.
But yeah, what a trip, man, to return to Doctor Who after all those years.
Yeah, it must have been fun. Well, I'm super grateful
Yeah.
he did, and they thought to do that.
Yeah, and
Um,
to go from one of the least memorable stories, Planet of
Right.
Evil, to
to
the
yeah,
most memorable
an
in
absolute
Blink.
legend. So
Yeah.
yeah, the kind of redeemed. I mean, the show
Yeah.
redeems itself a little bit in that way. That's
So
awesome.
when he dies because he falls into the black pool, which I'm sure, like they use that as a reference to Blackpool, the town. Which is a
Do
famous-
people die when they go there?
Yeah,
Isn't
I
there
mean,
like
they
a-
kind of. Blackpool is like a very, very low rent Vegas for
Yeah.
British people. It's like
Well, it's funny.
really-
It's also not to get too far on a tangent here. It's the setting of the Nightmare Fair, which is a big sequel. Was intended to be the sequel to the Celestial Toymaker. Was never produced.
Yeah.
It was a missing script from the Colin Baker years, but it's actually on Big
Interesting.
Finish and has been adapted for audio. And there's a
I
lot
feel
of there's a lot of jokes about Blackpool.
Yeah.
As they-
Yeah,
As
so
they-
you know the English predisposition to laugh at Blackpool and
Mm.
to any references to it. But yeah, I love the idea that the writer didn't necessarily know his sci-fi concepts, but he knew to get in a dig at Blackpool. in writing
Nice.
it.
Well, you gotta dig those cities, man. If I were writing it, that Toronto would not come out very good in whatever script I was writing.
Yes, the Toronto pool on the Planet of Evil. So there are two influences for this story, and I use the word influences advisedly, but they are Forbidden Planet and
absolutely.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
Pete, how familiar are you with either of those?
Well, Jekyll and Hyde. Well, I've seen I've seen the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. To my shame. No, actually, I think that movie's a little bit underrated, but and obviously based on the graphic novel as well. And it's just certainly the story. Everyone sort of knows the original story, even if I'm
Sure.
not sure if I ever actually saw it / read it. It was, but everyone knows sort of the
Yeah,
what
and I
it's
think
based on.
that the thing that people instinctively know about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that it's really a metaphor,
Mhm.
right? It's about
Sure.
the good and evil in man, and there are many interpretations of which particular good and evil, Robert Louis Stevenson was actually writing about at the time. People have sort of made up the idea that he was on cocaine while he was writing it, like Edward Hyde was sort of a manifestation of himself on cocaine. No, not really. He was just sort of interested in the good and evilness of everyone, right? The dual nature of humanity, and specifically the subconscious, which is something that was starting to come out when he was writing Jekyll and Hyde, like the 1890s. Like Freud was starting to be active, and Vienna, and this whole notion that we have a subconscious that we can't control was starting to come out. In Forbidden Planet, it's like even more explicit, because the creature in Forbidden Planet, that's sort of the forerunner of the of Anti-Man in Planet of Evil, is called the creature from the id, like literally using a Freudian concept. And it is, so the story of Forbidden Planet is that there's a professor, Dr. Morbius, who lands on this planet, and he uses this sort of ancient technology, and unbeknownst to him, this ancient technology is producing this monstrous version of his id at night that goes out and kills people. So you can see, like, Planet of Evil definitely supposed to reference that, like the creature, the way it's sort of created with the color separation overlay looks very much like the creature in Forbidden Planet.
Right.
But the one thing they forgot to bring is the metaphor.
Yeah.
Like in both of those cases, in Jekyll and Hyde and Forbidden Planet, the monster is a manifestation of one person's subconscious. So if you had it that, Anti-Man or whatever is a manifestation of Sorensen, as it sort of is at the end, like there are multiple versions of him at the end.
Yeah, but they're all kind of just
confusing.
these carbon copies that,
Yeah.
it's just to produce the crisis. It's
Yeah, and
nothing really sophisticated about it.
Exactly. There's no intent to produce any sort of metaphor here, any sort of deeper commentary on the nature of man or the subconscious. Yeah, it's just like, yeah, we got to have a monster.
Yeah, I get that, and I think it is. If your expectations are sort of set by those, not just those works, but better realizations of this idea in sci-fi. So I'm thinking specifically of a couple of Star Trek episodes, The Enemy Within, where Captain Kirk is split into two, obviously very Jekyll and Hyde, as well as the Star Trek's own take on this idea of an antimatter universe, which is the alternative factor. I wouldn't count Mirror Mirror in that stuff, like the mirror, because that's kind of almost like a separate thing. Let's put that aside. But like,
it's not the same as an antimatter universe, right? That's a whole other concept.
Yeah, so I think those were better sort of metaphors for this, and I think it's taking the most sort of basic spectacle friendly parts of Forbidden Planet and Dr. Jekyll and just sort of throws them in for fun. But it's kind of fun, to defend the story a little bit. Like, I remember as a kid being kind of hella scared of like I know they're kind of like, they were glowy. They almost look like gummy bears in his eyes when he pulls his hands back, and it's like,
the eyes were super creepy.
Yeah, it's because it's a little unexpected because you're not quite sure. You're ready for the contact lenses, like something, but then it's like, oh wow, they're just like these weird glowy eye thingies.
How did they? I'm not even sure how they did that effect.
I think they just painted his eyelids, and then it was like a special kind of light you shine that doesn't, screw up the shadows or whatever, or maybe just like some, doing the green screen on just the eyelids. So I believe that's how they did it. And what was I going to say? Oh, so okay, little note about this story. So my son, he's 11 years old. He likes Doctor Who, but up until very, very recently, he just did not want to engage with the classic series. And I wasn't going to like push it on him, even though I grew up on it. I was just super glad he liked the new series. So now that in this podcast, he's noticed that I'm watching more and more original Who, he's gotten interested. And this is the first classic series episode I watched in its entirety with him. Ooh. And he thought the stuff on the ship when Sorensen was loose was really cool because it reminded him of Among Us. So it's like, because it plays a little bit on, the classic Doctor Who trope of like, oh, the Doctor and the companion get blamed for the real bad guys.
Yeah.
And they're constantly like, did they kill them? No, they couldn't have. They're here. Well, what about this? And then, it's sort of reminding him a lot of like, well, who's the imposter? Like, well, this guy was over there. He couldn't have been him. And I helped this guy and he's the scientist. Like, so, if you kind of see it a little bit as this meta whodunit, I think you might have some fun. It's just too bad there's not enough color among the other crew members to really make that sort of the fun thing it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's so okay.
Or it could have been.
It really could have been a lot better, right? I mean, it's my immediate response to watching Planet of Evil was I like, if Doctor and Sarah don't have much to do in this. That's sort of a common critique of this story, but I kind of just like them hanging out on the planet. It's an amazing set when you see them walking through it.
Yeah, let's talk about that, man. Yeah, that set was epic, and you kind of can tell right away. Like, you're like, even if you're not used to Doctor Who's sort of relatively cheap look, like, I think if you're just sort of looking at this as like, oh, it's a piece of television from the 70s, you're like, oh wow, like I really get the atmosphere they're going for here. It's like kind of scary and grim and the jungle, and that's wow.
And kind of psychedelic as well. I mean, this is, I wouldn't want to suggest that our listeners who happen to be in weed legal states might like to experience Doctor Who, or this particular story of Doctor Who in an altered state, but it might also be quite fitting, given that there's not really much plot, but there's a lot of lovely, interesting visuals, very, very colorful. And, you know, Tom Baker basically goes into this LSD trip when he jumps into the antimatter pool. So that's kind of fun and interesting. So visually very interesting.
Yeah,
You
luckily you
know,
had a friend with some lemon slices and waiting for him. All right, dude. Hold his
exactly.
hair over the toilet.
Don't go tripping into black pools, kids. Or go tripping in Blackpool. But also, I mean, there's this fun sort of almost new series-esque dialogue between them, right? When the Doctor brings up Shakespeare, kind of randomly, and they muse about the fact that Doctor says Shakespeare wasn't a very good actor, and Sarah's like, oh, well, maybe that's why he became a writer. And Doctor's like, yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Such a writer line.
Right? You can't make it as an actor, graduate to a writer. But another interesting thing about the Doctor in this, apart from the fact that he loses his scarf,
Right. It's a weird one
which
for
is
that.
odd.
Yeah.
Apparently, it was just easier for the special effects if he didn't have his scarf on.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting things. So this comes from an excellent series of books that I can recommend called "Running Through Corridors" by Robert Shearman and Toby Hadoke. It's a name you might know from other Doctor Who podcasts.
Robert Sherman wrote Dalek, right? Am I right?
I think you
Am I
might
wrong?
be right about that. Yeah. So they basically, it's basically a running diary of them watching every single episode. They rather boringly, I think, take it in order. But anyway, they when they're watching this, Robert Sherman points out that he's like, this is all of a sudden, this is New Who Doctor here, right? Because all of a sudden he goes from the old sort of version of what the Doctor would be in a sciencey episode like this, which is sort of learning alongside the viewer and learning alongside the explorers, and perhaps he's sort of a little bit ahead of the game, like just because his brain works faster. But here we have the Doctor as sort of almost New Who like God.
Yeah.
Right? He all of a sudden he understands that this is an antimatter planet, which nobody else gets. And there's no sort of trail of breadcrumbs to lead him there. He just knows.
No.
You know, he just knows things about the universe. He eats jelly babies and he knows things. Or in this case, toffee, because he puts those antimatter pebbles in a toffee tin. But it's sort of like he takes that trip down that black pit, has his conference with Anti-Man, and none of which we get to see. We don't get to see him promising as a time. By the way, he fluffed his line where he says, I gave my word to Anti-Man, and he was supposed to say, I gave my word as a Time Lord, which is why Liz Sladen then says, you gave your word as a Time Lord? But he doesn't. Tom Baker doesn't say the Time Lord part. It's a total fluffing of the line, and so Liz Sladen's left hanging out there to dry. And we're like, why did she say as a Time Lord?
Yeah, Tom Baker had a few moments like that. Not as many as William Arnold, but I when we get to Legopolis, I'll point out another.
Once he started having his 3-pint lunches.
Right. Well,
yeah.
So interesting. So you think sort of the godlike Doctor is sort of more of a staple of New Who, and you're probably right.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of any Doctor specifically who was more?
I mean, it's a very Tennant-y thing to do, right? I'm the oncoming storm. All of that stuff. You know, where thinking of Asylum of the Daleks, like, or Pandorica opens, like the Doctor is suddenly in New Who an expert in the entire universe. Maybe not in the Eccleston years, but you know, increasingly with Russell T Davies, who sort of started seeing him as God with like Last of the Time Lords. It's very the Doctor as God kind of episode. And this is, you know, according to these guys who have at this point been watching every single story, you know, through Planet of Evil, they see this distinct new version of Who coming out kind of early. So I like the idea that this, you know, kind of unassuming story that's kind of forgotten, kind of mid-list Baker era stuff might have actually been the turning point.
Interesting. Yeah, just to sort of give my impression. Whenever someone talks about sort of a godlike doctor who's sort of way ahead of game and sort of playing an elaborate game of chess almost, I think of Sylvester McCoy, actually, especially his later stories, which were kind of like really very much leaned into that. And that you find, Vandal Cardbell at the time was apparently like that was his whole plan, and he had this whole thing that he was laying out before it was canceled. In New Who, I think it comes and goes. I think you're right. I think some doctors more than others, and I think with Davies it was more performative in that like he would have these grand moments, but less of sort of the ongoing. I'm just sort of in charge, 3 steps ahead of everyone. And I felt like Moffat was more that. So I do think you're right. I just think it was like Moffat was probably the epitome of it in my view.
You might be right. There's more of a Moffat-y thing, but certainly we've seen that so much in New Who, that the moment where the Doctor is like, "Stop! You don't understand what you're doing. You're meddling in forces beyond your comprehension."
Yeah, and he does that a lot here. And what it doesn't quite sync up with, and you can see this as a last-minute decision, was Sorensen surviving.
Yeah,
and so Sorensen lives at the end because they thought killing him was so grim, but like everything the Doctor's doing and says, all the dialogue implies like he's a goner. Like even at he hands him, and this is actually I think one of the best moments in the whole story, when the Doctor appeals to him as a scientist and is like, you've done this, and you bear the responsibility. You take the antimatter. I mean, it doesn't make any sense as a story, as a plot element, because what are you doing handing the thing to the bad guy? I mean, he's not a bad guy, but it's like at the very least he could be debilitated at any time. Like, and you're trusting him to go do this? Like, that's just dumb. But the character moment is very real, and I thought was excellent. Because Sorensen does it. He's like, you know what? He's right, and I'm going to sacrifice not just my work, but myself for this. Now, in addition
kind of
to
a dark
that,
moment when you think about it. It's a super dark moment because the Doctor is trying to convince someone to commit suicide.
Yeah, totally. And he just kind of stands there and lets him go and do it. Doesn't even look at him. But he's already said that, what you've done to yourself with this this antidote thing, this anti-quark vaccine. If only you got the Pfizer vaccine. You got the Pfizer anti-quark vaccine was the 2 doses, you're done.
And then you get the Delta variant of antimatter, which is another problem.
Yeah. So, but he gave him but he said he's already transformed. Like, it's like, you've already, like, he basically says, like, you've already screwed up your insides so bad, you're dead. You're going to die anyway. So I think that's kind of what the Doctor was sort of, if you could justify his, like, go kill yourself, like, moment, like that, you could say that's it. But then, of course, at the end, he's just like, he's the creature cures him, I guess, just because, all right, thanks for giving me back my rocks.
Yep.
Here's your guy back.
I'll spit you out now.
Now, can we talk for a minute just how weird the take on antimatter itself is here?
Yes.
Because even at the time, right? Like, I think we knew what antimatter was, and
we had theories.
Yeah, I mean, like the Star Trek was 6-7 years earlier, and they had a whole star drive system based on the annihilation that happens when matter and antimatter collide, and they never really quite spell it out, but it's strongly implied that, like, they have this dilithium thing that keeps it from doing that, or does it in a controlled way. So you can't just put it in a metal container and just like take it. Like, you can't mine it per se. Like, I mean, it just seemed really like, what? Like, that's not how antimatter works.
Those little silver sample buckets that Sorensen takes off the planet, it felt so British to me. It's like these tiny little lunch pail things. And it's just like, that's how we're going to transport these rocks in this thing that looks like a large squat thermos.
Yeah, well, you kind of think like, oh, I thought we ejected all the antimatter. I just got rid of all the beer. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
that was the mistake.
This is one of the reasons why Salamar doesn't work as a character, right? Because he just sort of takes it as read that all the antimatter's off the ship. because the underling said it was, and like the idea that someone, perhaps the scientist who was super keen to get some to his homeworld, might have taken some, put it in his cabin, doesn't even begin to occur to him.
Yeah, and like the whole Rosencrantz and Guildensterning of those two guys, the very working class dudes who do it, sort of implies they're so incompetent, right? Like they couldn't even keep track, which I guess is where that we're supposed to take from that.
Morelli and Dahan were those two guys, and oddly enough, one of them was Davros.
Yeah, Michael Wisher. It's funny, like he does this bit part, and even though he's now well known as like this legendary, like you had a legend in Doctor Who, the original Davros. Like what a performance! And
this is his last appearance.
Yeah, now he's this garbage disposal guy.
And unfortunately, a guy doing Indian accent at the very end over the column.
Yeah, very unfortunate.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. That's is that his final performance? Really? Oh my god.
Yep.
Oh no. Okay. Well, and he did Davros. Can we talk more about that?
Let's just focus on that. Yeah, let's focus on his years with Davros. But yeah, the antimatter thing. I mean, there are, you're right. There's so many more interesting ways that could go, more scientifically accurate ways it could go, because we still don't know very much about what antimatter is. I've just been reading up for it in preparation for this podcast. I didn't know that there was a legitimate interpretation of what antimatter is that says that they might be regular particles going backwards in time.
Oh wow, that's cool.
Right? Isn't that's such a Doctor Who-ish thing that we could have explored? Like, I feel like this planet of antimatter, it just sort of, it's wasted on this. Doctor Who's treatment of antimatter is wasted on the script.
Well, and you'd have to you wouldn't have a jungle set. You'd have to do a completely different thing, probably more along the lines of the Impossible Planet. But I remember reading once years and years ago, and I'm not sure if this is still taken seriously by science, but they postulate that the universe, when it was created, there's no reason matter was created and not antimatter, that both were created, and the distribution wasn't even, so one annihilated the other and some survived. Like what survived is matter, but there's not a hard and fast rule that there can't be antimatter somewhere from that sort of natural, either from that sort of leftover from that sort of bang post Big Bang, or just sort of naturally occurs somewhere. But then you would have this antimatter planet that you couldn't really go down to, but it would be a very kind of spark a completely different, very interesting story that would be a little more scientifically accurate.
Yeah, it would be like gamma ray flashes all over the place. That's an antimatter, antiparticle annihilation process. But yeah, exactly what you're talking about is still one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of physics, is why is there more matter in the universe than antimatter?
Right.
And we still don't know why that's the case. Scientists would love to know it. Like we're creating antimatter in places like CERN. Is right on the cutting edge. We're making antiprotons in the lab.
Totally safely, guys.
Yeah,
don't worry.
What could go wrong? It's all right. We won't take it off the planet in silver lunch pails, so we're all good. Oh man, and I love just right.
Yeah, and again, sorry, not to pile on the scientific inaccuracies, but what force exactly is pulling the ship, right?
Yeah,
it's not gravity, it's not electricity.
Yeah,
I guess
so the ship is at the end. The ship is being pulled down to the planet because it's got antimatter on it, which makes no sense. But there's a lot of other scientific stuff. Also, techno. This is a very technobabble heavy episode story.
Well, and you also just kind of wonder, what is the creature exactly, and what does it care that a little bit of antimatter has been taken out of its universe, right? Would we care if beings from an antimatter universe came here to take bits of matter, tiny, tiny bits of matter from our universe, like a rock, and take it back to their universe as a limitless energy source? I'm like, dude, this sounds like a great trade.
Yeah, take those pebbles. Sounds
Yeah.
good. Yeah,
Oh,
all
weird.
about it. But there's one point at which Sarah sort of exclaims the Big Bang, as if we're supposed to know what like. That's her response to what would happen if the antimatter goes back to the planet that they're trying to take it to.
Right, which is isn't that the idea? Not to destroy it, but like
Yeah,
we want to
yeah.
release the energy in a controlled way so that we
And then
have it.
at the very end, just to make this whole thing a Shaggy Dog story, the Doctor gives Sorensen a whole other way to get energy,
Hmm.
which we're told. So I had a quick look at the Terrence Dicks novel, the adaptation of this,
Right.
where it's like the Doctor, when he does this, is sort of aware that he's breaking a Time Lord rule. The energy idea that he gives him is just use the kinetic energy of planets or planetary motion.
Right.
So,
Which sounds a bit like a perpetual motion machine.
You're right.
But
and he just says, "Hey, think about this," and Sorensen's just like, "You're right. We could use that."
well, funnily
why were we-
enough,
Why were we bothering?
that whole idea
PhD
was
into this?
what they ran with that idea in the novels. So
Yeah.
I didn't read this one, but there's a novel, Zeta Major,
Mm.
which essentially shows what happened next. And he runs with the idea, and his whole civilization pins their hopes on this technology that takes the energy from planets, and it just doesn't work. It just
Thanks,
doesn't work.
Doctor.
So to basically make it work, they go back to the original plan, which is let's get them antimatter. And guess what, guys? This time it's Jurassic World. We've got our shit together. We figured it out. We can do this. And they do it, and guess what? The Indominus Rex busts out
Yep.
and eats everybody. So
You scientists were so preoccupied with whether you could harvest antimatter. You didn't
Anyway.
think about whether you should.
Zeta Major, Past Doctor Adventure, has the Davidson Doctor. So good times, Fifth Doctor.
I'm sort of interested to follow up that. This is one of the things that I really love about Doctor Who is that the fact that the attendant media can take sort of, kind of crappy one-off stories like this and just spin it out a little bit further.
Yeah.
Even though it is kind of a too neat resolution in this, the Doctor to give away some Time Lord secret in 10 words or less about how to get perpetual motion.
Well,
it's
I really
nice
like,
to
yeah,
deal with that.
I really love it when whether it's a series or something else shows like the basically the butterfly effect, which is that the
Yes.
little ripples left by the Doctor create massive waves further down. And I think there's another episode coming up shortly after this one, which is the Face of Evil. Another evil. They love evil in this era, but which shows exactly that, which is like he did this thing somewhere, and then because he did it, the computer and the civilization evolved in a completely different way, and the image of the Doctor ends up being this god or something, which I thought was really, really clever.
Yeah, I love that stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, so we should deal with both the title, Planet
Mhm.
of Evil, which is inaccurate. It's not an evil planet.
Yeah.
It just, it's like, hey, you came to this planet, you invaded it, basically,
Mhm.
and you tried to take its rocks, and it's perfectly fair. It's not evil at all for it to fight back. But also, we should talk about our regular feature, what if the evil plot had succeeded, which I think is going to be a little hard to figure out in this instance what the evil plot actually is.
Yeah. And whose evil plot is it?
Yeah.
So I totally agree that the title doesn't fit at all. I honestly don't see, in the evil sense, any evil here, except maybe Salamar.
Yeah.
Who's just kind of a upper class jerk and is more concerned of his own ego than saving people.
We haven't even got to the fact that Salamar tried to eject the Doctor and Sarah in coffins. In coffins. And we had that whole scene to lead up to it. Very, very odd scene, but I think a really nice one that actually kind of fleshed out the culture of this empire. With the one crew member dies and he gets a burial at space, and they ask him like what religion was he, He was what is it? Movellan Orthodox? They're not Movellans, but it's I forget what the name of this damn empire is in Planet of Evil, but anyway, it's that.
Morestron,
Oh,
right?
Morestron. Thank you,
Yeah.
Morestron. He's Morestron Orthodox, and Wyszynski says, "Oh, one of those." And he's like, he presses a few buttons, and the hymns start playing or whatever the litany is, and he's like, "Oh, we don't have to listen to that." So this poor guy who's getting buried, like his last rites are not being heard by anyone because apparently he's in the wrong religion, which is it's a very sort of snooty upper class and kind of out of character thing for Wyszynski to do because he was supposed to be the nice guy.
Yeah,
in
totally.
other regards.
Like that could have been in a better story a very good tone setting moment.
Yes,
of an apathetic, cynical, and generally evil crew. But that's not the case here. It's just sort of forgettable with like one guy who's unhinged and one guy who's actually kind of ends up being kind of noble.
Yeah, and it's sort of a setup for the episode 3 cliffhanger where the Doctor and Sarah are going to be ejected in the same manner, and also the source of the weirdest fight in between Wyszynski and Salamar. Salamar's trying to get. I don't know whether he doesn't want his own, the blood on his hands, but he's like trying to push Wyszynski's hand onto the lever that will release the coffins with the Doctor and Sarah in.
Yeah.
Like why not just do it yourself, dude?
Yeah, I feel like, it was they should have just scrapped that idea of like this. They obviously wanted to increase some suspense and tension and like, are they gonna get ejected or not? It's like the fact that they're just in the coffins, I think, and bound is enough. And you kind of like want you could just have them land on it, like in a struggle. But I don't know. I mean, because I don't want to just pin this on like bad stunt coordination. It's bad stunt coordination, but it's like the good stunts and good fights tell a story throughout, right? With different, people getting the upper hand, changes in stakes even in the middle of it. And this one, they I see what they were trying to do, but they should have just said, no, that's not working, and let's just have it be a random thing that they land on it and they get thrown out.
So we have three real options for what the evil plot is in Planet of Evil. It could be the planet's quote unquote evil plot to not let them leave and kill them all. In which case the Doctor and Sarah would have just escaped on the TARDIS.
Well, the Doctor would have. So it depends when this happens, right? Because if it's at the last minute where Sarah's still on the ship and the Doctor's a little late, say his struggle with Sorensen in the TARDIS takes a little too long, maybe another 25 seconds, shall we say, the planet crash, boom, done. Everyone dead.
Yeah.
So then the Doctor's very sad and vows to, I don't know, be an antimatter warrior, destroying the Morestron Empire.
An antimatter warrior, preventing other empires from finding out this technology. We should take a diversion there because this is a story that, well, first of all, it's the first time, amazingly, it's the first time we see Tom Baker at the TARDIS controls.
Right. Yeah, crazy.
Just one story before Pyramids of Mars, which the randomizer has taken us to. The randomizer does love to take us to stories before the stories or stories just after the stories we've done, which I suppose is proof of just how random it is. But yeah, we see him in the same control room in Pyramids of Mars, where it's much more used. And of course, that story famously has the episode 3 break where they're like, oh, let's go forward to 1980 and see the result of the evil plot if it succeeds. And there's kind of a similar thing happening here where I think doesn't Sarah suggest that they leave at some point? Like, this isn't our fight, this isn't our struggle, let's just go. We're late for our meeting with the unit, let's go back.
Yeah, I forget I think that does it happen in episode 2 or even earlier? Or I'm not sure.
But I like that because that is one of my constant gripes about Classic Who and Who in general. We've discussed this before. The fact that they never just think of getting into the TARDIS and going. So it's nice to have that dealt with 2 stories in a row. But also especially this, and the Doctor comes out with something like, "Oh, we can't leave in the TARDIS because this will create a massive antimatter explosion." But he's sort of assuming that they'll somehow get away from the planet with the antimatter, and the planet seems perfectly capable of doing that by itself.
Right. I mean, yeah, you could argue it's just like, well, if the planet does it, everyone's dead, right? So we have to save the people and get the antimatter back, which I don't know, save some of them. But if on the let's just go tangent, I almost feel like this is like Sarah's first attempt at this, and she does it again the next episode, and he does the whole alternate 1980 thing to just basically shut her up for good. Like, okay, Sarah, stop asking me to do that. Whether it's a trick or not, like, this is we can't have a show if you keep asking us to go before we fight the bad guys. So let's just do that.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's a progression. I wonder if it was intended as that. All right, so
Maybe.
that's the
Liz
evil
Sladen
planet
doing that. Yeah.
is evil plot.
Okay, what's the second one?
If the evil plot is Sorensen's, well, that just wasn't going to succeed either, right? Because you're not going to escape this planet with that antimatter. It's just not going to happen.
Because they have that magical force that can just stop you. Yeah, so I don't think that can succeed unless the only thing I could think of, right, is if he figures out who the Doctor is and what the TARDIS is, and therefore he surmises, and this is kind of a feature of better episodes that happen later when the TARDIS and the Doctor is the X Factor, where it's like, oh, I had this evil plot, but now I realize the power that you have, and I want that. So he could actually take the TARDIS and like get, transport the antimatter away that way. And then you kind of wonder, if he does do that, what does the antimatter monster do? Can it track the TARDIS if it goes like, 20 galaxies that way? And can it do anything? Guess we'd find out.
You could have a whole season-long arc.
Well, we've seen creatures later that are that powerful. So like the puddle woman who fell in love with Bill apparently was powerful enough to travel in time into the end of the universe, and they couldn't flee from it. So not a stretch to think that antimatter monster, which has magical force powers, could pursue Sorensen no matter how far he went, and that could like lay waste to big parts of the universe. In that, like, you get sort of a Legopolis effect. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
And it could also be a Keys to Time and Space season, an early version of that, proto version of that.
Oh, it's almost like they go from story to story, and then episode 4 is always the antimatter monster shows up and destroys everything. It's like the end of a Berserk level with evil, just like, okay, everyone's dead. You just got to get out of here.
Yeah, guess we gotta go.
The Langoliers, that's another one. I'm trying to think of all these things where like destructive forces, they're forces of nature that just come and kill everything at the end.
Well, speaking of using the TARDIS, the Doctor does have to keep Salamar away from it, who's got his own evil, potentially plot thing going on. He's wants to use or could potentially use the interior of the TARDIS, but he's just sort of interested in it. And I love that the Doctor holds him at bay by saying, as you can see, this is the outside is an ordinary London police box. Like someone from an empire of humans 300,000 years in the future, or whatever this is going to recognize a 1960s London police box.
I don't know, but it's some history books, some history files. What would be the equivalent today? Someone from ancient Egypt. It'd have to be something mundane, some kind of like grain holding thing, a shelf.
Yeah,
I don't know what it would be.
Exactly. As you can see from the hieroglyphics on the front, this is clearly a grain silo from the Second Dynasty.
Of course it is. I am not stupid. It's like the line. I think that's the line.
Yeah.
So does he have much of an evil plot, Salamar?
Salamar's evil plot is just that he's always right.
Mhm.
and what he says goes, and he like without the Doctor even being there, it's sort of interesting to consider if the Doctor hadn't responded to this distress signal, what would have happened? Well, they would have picked Sorensen up with his antimatter. They would have tried to got him off the planet. It wouldn't have succeeded. They all would have died, right? So
Right.
I feel like all Salamar's roads lead to crashing into the planet because he's just a terrible commander.
Yeah, so again, it depends sort of when this happens. So if the Doctor never shows up, yeah, they all die because they can't take off, and no one thinks to use the reactor accelerator on the force field or whatever, which drives the monster away. So the monster would have just
Yeah.
killed everyone then. If it happens later and they've already taken off, maybe is it possible Salamar just starts killing people and throwing people off the ship until he gets rid of the antimatter? And would that have worked? I feel like he's that unhinged and desperate
Mm.
and such an extremist that he would eventually just like, you know what? We've tried killing everybody else. Sorensen, get in the freaking coffin thing. We're done with you. And maybe that would have worked.
I just don't see him trying stuff. You know what? He really strikes me as a kind of, we've tried nothing, we're all out of options kind of guy.
Yeah.
That is basically.
Even though there's
his MO.
someone here pointing at a shelf full of options. Dude, no, we got all these other things we do. There's really just nothing we can do. We have to kill everyone and eject them.
Yes.
But we could do we could stop the ship, or we could do this other thing. We could actually land it. And it's like, no, we have to kill everybody.
Yes. And again, in the Terrence Dicks novelization, in the Terrence Dicks papering over the cracks style that he has, he does add this thing about how Wyszynski really should have been the commander, but he didn't have friends in high places.
Yeah, well, I think that's you do think like Wyszynski looks older and more experienced,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think did they ever address that directly? I don't think they do. Like, why?
Not
isn't
in the
this-
show.
Yeah,
But yeah, in the novelization, Terrence Dicks cannot let that one go, and he's like, Salamar is wearing some sort of gold chain that signifies that his family has connections.
like does that
Right.
did script editors then just think that was extraneous? Because I feel like that would have been a great line, even if it just took like
Right.
a few seconds. And I'm reminded of like, actually, I think it was the movie A Few Good Men where Jack Nicholson talks to his second in command and sort of talks about how he was promoted faster than his second in command was, and sort of rubs it in his face a little bit. But like, it's a good character building line for both of them, and really shows a bit of depth and reveals something about their motivations later on. And I think that would have been very similar case here.
Yeah,
It's too bad
but
it didn't make it.
they're just cookie cutter space soldiers, unfortunately.
Yeah,
And there's no
disco
thought
outfits,
into that.
plunging V-necks.
And I think maybe you would sort of intuit in the highly stratified class culture of Britain in the 70s. Maybe you would intuit that Salamar is a rich kid, just because he shouts his received pronunciation English accent louder than the rest. He's just sort of, you would just understand. Oh yeah, he's some privileged kid who just rose through the ranks too fast because he daddy's got a friend somewhere.
It's funny. I remember when he was doing the shouty bits later in like episode 3 and 4. I remembered him suddenly from another Doctor Who episode, which was the Ribos operation, where he does some shouty bits. And I will say this: his fashion sense does not improve dramatically. Anyway, little teaser for when we get to that episode.
Oh, I'm super excited for the Ribos operation.
Me too.
Yeah. It's a fascinating character. I don't know. But speaking of privilege, speaking of the obvious privilege that he has, I do like that line, to go back to when the Doctor and Sorensen are talking about sort of Sorensen's obligation as scientists. He has that great line about how it is our privilege as scientists to investigate, and that gives us this responsibility. Which I thought was a beautiful line, and probably one of my favorites of the story. With just that moment there, the Doctor bringing up scientific privilege. It's not quite as neat as you were so preoccupied with whether you could, you didn't think about whether you should. But still holds up today.
Doctor Who sometimes gets a bad rap for being like full of technobabble, really not really. I don't know if sophisticated is the word, but I think probably sometimes it's talked about as like sort of this very basic, iconic view of sort of scientific concepts, which you kind of either like or you don't. But what it doesn't get enough credit for in the original series is its reverence and respect for science and the scientific method, and that idea of intellect. Well, I mean, it does get credit for this, but I mean, intellect rooted in science, I think, is kind of what it's really trying to do, and showing that is sort of a gateway to not just understanding but solving real problems. And I think that permeates throughout many eras, and I think it often generates lines, not often, but every now and then generates lines like this one that I think are some of the best dialogue in the series.
Yeah, so here's the line. You and I are scientists, Professor. We buy our privilege to experiment at the cost of total responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like it.
I do too.
It's actually, and Tom Baker likes it because it's the only thing from Planet of Evil on his official website.
I would love to see that pinned up somewhere or engraved somewhere,
right?
At an institution somewhere. I hope someone's done that. If you have, write in. Leave us a review.
If there are any scientists out there listening, please pin this up in your lab. We buy our privilege to experiment at the cost of total responsibility. Not that we're saying you're irresponsible, scientists. It's just that Doctor Who makes us think that you are about to destroy the planet at any moment.
It's
because you had a hangover.
We've been there, but I got to say, just to close the thought on it, I think it's a pretty good Hippocratic oath for science. Honestly, I like it.
Total responsibility.
Nice work, Doctor Who.
Yeah.
So how do you not like this one, Chris? At least a little bit. I mean, come on. It's a bit of a Dalek, not quite an Ogron.
It's
banged up Dalek, kind of a boring Dalek in the background, wobbly, had a few too many drinks.
Anytime that Tom Baker and Liz Sladen are on screen in this episode, it's a Dalek.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's an Ogron. It was interestingly, as I've often said, like the BBC doesn't repeat enough Doctor Who. It did repeat this one, and the repeats like almost immediately, and the repeats did not do too well. It had like 10 million people watch this on the first outing. That's as many people as watched Voyage of the Damned, which is still a record, I think, in new Doctor Who.
Wow.
10 million people, pretty much for all 4 episodes, and then the repeat was like 5 million, 4 million, 3 million. Like it did not hold up.
Yeah. Well, word of mouth back then. I guess what was the thing we talked about last time? The rating index. They had some kind of index at the BBC.
Yeah. Audience appreciation index, something like that.
Tapered off.
Been able to, yeah.
we got to look at sort of like for these 4 episode serials, which has the worst tapering of the audience appreciation index? Because the Crotons is pretty bad too, I think.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
In terms of when did people tune out? The last couple of stories in the Crotons, and even surprisingly in the first regeneration story, The 10th Planet, there was this tremendous drop off of audience towards the end. So
I love the thought of Philip Hinchcliffe asking his analytics guy, what was our completion rate on that story?
Yes. Storytellers
stats, man. We need more charts to tell us what to do on Doctor Who.
It was definitely not Moneyball in those days. I'll say that.
Alrighty.
Well,
shall we?
I think that's about all we can say about Planet of Evil.
Yeah, it'd be evil to go on. I'm here all week, guys. Shall we figure out where we're going next? Let's do that.
Absolutely.
Huh?
Yes.
Right, randomizer. You can take your evil.
Time to reintroduce our totally evil randomizer.
Yeah. We'll raise it some chaotic good.
All right, and you've got the spreadsheet there.
Spreadsheet open.
Stories from 1 to 297.
All right.
We have broken down all Doctor Who. If you're new to Pull to Open, we've broken down all Doctor Who into 297 discrete stories. And that's in a spreadsheet. And while Peter's looking at that spreadsheet, I go to random.org, which has true random number generation based on atmospheric noise, rather than the usual computerized attempt to have randomness via algorithm, which doesn't really work. And we can tell it's totally random because we've already mentioned in this episode of Pull to Open, there's sort of this weird bunching up of which stories the randomizer has chosen. Right, there are massive gaps, especially in the Baker era and the Tennant era, and definitely in the Matt Smith era. Like we haven't had a single Matt Smith story. So
we've never done Colin Baker or Sylvester McCoy. Shorter runs certainly, but also
and also no Eccleston. No Paul McGann. How could that be?
Well, now you're doing it.
Now I'm dooming us to the TV movie, aren't I?
Well, it's all good. But then, Chris, I feel like we need more process here. I feel like we need to first prime the randomizer.
Okay. Yeah, you like to give the randomizer challenges.
We must prime it.
You challenged it 2 weeks ago or 2 episodes ago to give us a true missing story. Not just this, 10th planet, 4th episode is missing kind of thing, but a true missing story.
Right.
That we can really sink our teeth into.
Well, this time, in celebration of our earlier discussion, I'm going to dare it yet again. Give us a long one. I'm shooting us in the foot here.
Wow.
Now we have divided Trial of a Time Lord into its requisite parts, right? So it's I'm really aiming more for Dalek's Master Plan or War Games on this. I will settle for Doctor Who and the Silurians or Ambassadors of Death. Any of those 7-parters will do. Or The Invasion, which is nice and long.
Yep. Okay. Well, I guess the sooner we get those out of the way, the easier the rest of this journey is going to be. All right. So you've issued 2 challenges to the randomizer.
I don't know if I'm really comfortable with the last one I just did. It's like the middle of summer. It's like, do we have time for that?
I was going to say, this is the equivalent of taking an umbrella along on your summer vacation.
Well, maybe it's I think the reverse psychology is going to work here a little bit. It's going to give us something easy. So see what happens. I probably shouldn't have said that out loud.
Randomizer. All right. Here we go. You ready?
3.
You're going to give me the countdown?
3 again. 2. 1.
Don't blink.
100.
Ooh. Wow. An even 100? No way.
An even 100.
Well, my friend, we have arrived yet again in the Tom Baker era, but in the middle of the Key to Time saga, it is the androids of Tara.
Ooh.
Nice.
Okay. So the randomizer did pick up on me talking about the Keys to Time season earlier, and obviously thought, well, that's a good idea. Let's see some more of that fabulous Black Guardian guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the bird on the head.
Well, I don't know if he's actually in this one, but it is in that era, and I kind of remember this one a little bit. Yeah, it's like it's a cute one. I mean, if you can have a cute Key to Time episode, but there's some fun stuff to be had here, as I recall.
I definitely did not see. It's going to be our first Romana story.
Yeah.
Right. And
our first Romana story.
First Romana. Well, that's exciting.
It's gonna be good. It's gonna be interesting, like doing these Key to Time episodes in a strange order. You would never do it this way, but we're doing it this way. We're coming in and coming out every now and then.
But this is not like they don't actually have the randomizer in this story, do they?
They have not invented it yet. The Key to Time is what leads the Doctor to invent the randomizer. So it's kind of like the randomizer showing us its origins.
Right. Very long origin story. I think I get this mixed up with Mask of Mandroga, with Mandroga or whatever that
was.
Mandragora, thank you. Which is another one set in a sort of feudal. But that's actually feudal, whereas this is futuristic feudal.
This is other planet style. Feudal. It's good times, though. Yeah. There's castles and stuff, though. Counts, etc. It's going to be great.
Well, I'm looking forward to Tom Baker. I will never have too much Tom Baker, especially Tom Baker that I haven't seen.
Awesome. And I'm looking forward to doing this all again. And with everyone who has been listening again. It'll be fun as we embark again on more Tom Baker and our first Key to Time, our first Romana, and first everything. And thank you all for listening to us here. This has been Pull to Open. It is a podcast. In case you weren't sure, this is a thing you can subscribe to in an app, in a podcast app. If you're not in that, encountering us somewhere on the web, go and subscribe. Fire up your podcast app. Fire up your iTunes. Fire up your Spotify. Anywhere you get podcasts. Go ahead, find us. We're Pull to Open. Subscribe to the program. And feel free to leave a review. We love those reviews. Keep them coming. If you are leaving a review, we may even take what you have written and talk about it on the show, which we like to do.
Yeah, and also let us know if you were our 1,000th follower on TikTok. We did promise some sort of reward for that, so please do write in if that was you.
If that was you, yeah. Actually, I screen cap. It's not clear who it is, but we'll reach out. It's an interesting handle, shall we say? But yeah, please reach out. We'll get that no prize to you. No, it's a prize. We'll get you the prize to you as soon as we make contact. Contact will be made. Follow us on the socials. We TikTok. We are at Pull to Open. We're having a lot of fun on TikTok, sharing the videos. It's been great. We're also on Twitter and on Instagram at Pull to Open 63. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.